Good morning, guys and gals. Welcome to Fundamental Podcasts, understanding faith so as to more effectively debunk it. I'm your host, Niall Mallory, and for the first real episode on the podcast, I figured the best place to start would be with the Bible itself. As many of you will already be familiar with, the Bible defines the beliefs and the culture of Christian groups. If our goal is to really understand their perspectives and why they act the way they do, we really cannot hope to succeed without an understanding of the scriptures as well. I also wanted to cover this topic because I think it's one region that can be very grossly misunderstood by the atheist community. I often hear atheists spout off the line that the Bible was just thrown together by barely literate camel herders a few thousand years ago. And while I certainly see their perspective on that, it's a pretty serious generalization that misses out on a lot of the important nuance that these texts have carried for centuries. We skeptics will have a lot easier of a time debating with Christians and formulating our objections to their radical beliefs if we put forth the effort to grasp the concepts they hold dear, regardless of whether we have disagreements with Christians as to the validity of the texts. So, in order of most general to more specific, what actually is the Bible? The Bible, in its most common form in America, is a collection of 66 books, written by a variety of different authors from different time periods. Some of the authors are well known or even introduce themselves in the text. Others are, completely unknown. A lot of Christians will have an opinion on who the authors are for each text, but in cases that I'll delve deeper into later, there's very little evidence at all in any direction as to who wrote some of these books. But so inside this massive collection of texts, you have a myriad of different genres. You have historical accounts, letters written between persons, religious instruction from influential clergymen, and even poetry. It's important to note here that a good number of these texts included in the Bible were never actually intended by the authors to be a part of any holy book. Sometimes they were just writings only vaguely connected to religion at all. Later on, though, Christians would amass the texts and kind of just say, hey, I like this, and add it to the canon. More on that later. But what unites this mess of genres is that Christians believe all of them to be messages from God. Not literally, of course, because as I said, they were written by human authors. Christians instead hold fast to the idea that God inspired the authors to write the books and that they are utterly and supremely divine as a result. Very few devout Christians, as you will likely already know, will admit to any fault being found in the scriptures. That is entirely a result of this one doctrine. If they admit that scripture has errors, they have to admit that their God was wrong as well. As we will soon discuss, though, the errors are fairly unavoidable, regardless of how much radical Christians will deny them. The first half of the Bible's writings, the Old Testament, is divided into 4 sections. These are the Pentateuch, the historical accounts, the prophets, and the wisdom books. It stands as the basis for Christianity in its parent religion of Judaism, and so of course all these texts are part of the Hebrew Bible of the Jews as well. The Pentateuch are the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. They present a mythological creation story, a lineage narrative for the people of Israel through the centuries, and a whole host of laws like the 10 Commandments God supposedly gave to Moses and the nation of Israel on Mount Sinai. These books contain many of the famous verses, including the prohibitions on eating shrimp and wearing clothes made from mixed fabrics, as well as the condemnation of homosexuality as an abomination. Tradition holds that these books were written by Moses, but that belief has long since been criticized by biblical scholars. The general consensus today is that the books were written by the Jews during their captivity in Babylon around the 5th century BCE. Beyond just the question of its authorship, though, there is very little, or in some cases, absolutely no viable evidence for events occurring in the Pentateuch at all. Things like the Exodus out of Egypt, led by Moses, the conquest of Canaan, and others have left behind nothing for archaeologists to find, where one would expect there to be lots of evidence. Just beyond the Pentateuch, you have the historical accounts. These books, like Joshua, Chronicles, Kings, etc., they follow the nation of Israel after Moses, and well past the famous eras of King David and King Solomon. They contain much of the gross genocidal brutality many have heard of in the Bible, as Joshua, Moses' successor, leads a God-mandated conquest into modern-day Israel, killing every native man, woman, and child living there. With these books, you run into the exact same issues as before. While Christians might tote the alleged historical authenticity of their authorship, it is highly criticized by scholars and usually just recognized as a very romanticized tale of ancient Israel penned by authors way after the fact. In and amongst the historical accounts, you begin to run into the prophetic books. These are where unexperienced readers can get very confused. The prophets of ancient Israel, alleged to have received visions and messages from God, would write these messages down and present them to the people. The key thing to understand about the prophetic books is that they are not written to be straightforward commandments, as much as lessons learned and messages delivered through freakishly layered symbolism, metaphors, and references. This was very culturally relevant to the Jews, but not at all to modern Christians, which can source some of the pretty serious misconceptions about the books. For example, one of the greatest uses of the prophetic texts by Christians is to prove that God prophesied of Jesus' coming through a virgin birth with Mary. They quote Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14 as evidence of this. The issue is that when the chapter is read in its entirety, it becomes very clear that God wasn't talking about the Messiah or even an actual virgin. God was speaking about a young woman in the court at the time who was pregnant. The birth was supposed to be used by God as a sign to King Ahaz regarding his victory over coming invaders. Furthermore, the word Christians translate as virgin. It can mean a woman who has abstained from sex, but more commonly was used to refer to young women in general, not just virgins. This trend continues throughout Christian interpretations. They'll take comments or phrases mentioned in prophetic literature and vaguely connect it to Jesus in some way, claiming it to be a prophecy about him foretold hundreds of years beforehand. There's so much to talk about in this area, but for now I'm going to have to move on. I can make another episode over just biblical prophecy if you guys are interested. Finally, the wisdom books make up perhaps the most unique section of the Old Testament. They consist of Proverbs, Psalms, Ecclesiastes, Job, and Song of Solomon. Psalms and Song of Solomon are absolutely massive collections of poetry about God and man, often written to be accompanied with music. Christians attribute their authorship to David, Moses, Solomon, and a few others, but as is a common theme here, scholars almost entirely reject those ideas. The books of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes are collections of teachings intended to impart some kind of godly wisdom upon the reader. Proverbs introduces itself as a letter from King Solomon. Ecclesiastes is also commonly believed to be written by Solomon, but it doesn't actually claim that in the text. The author simply introduces himself as the teacher. Finally, you get to Job. Job is probably the most obscure of all the wisdom books, and even Christians can't really agree on who wrote it. It's a long narrative recounting the story of a man named Job when God allowed horrific pain and suffering into his life. It's widely acclaimed as a very sophisticated bit of prose and poetry mixed together, and so I actually intend to save discussing Job for a later standalone episode. And with that, we transition out of the Old Testament and into the New One. This is not only a significant jump theologically as we enter into the time of Jesus and the birth of Christianity as a separate religion from Judaism, but it's also a fairly significant time jump of over 400 years. The New Testament is divided into three-ish sections. These sections are the Gospels, the Epistles, and then the book of Revelation, capping it all off. The four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they're presented as eyewitness narratives of Jesus' life from birth to death. The names of each are their alleged authors, and they work together as the core of the Christian faith in Jesus. The first three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are further grouped as the three synoptic Gospels, as they are very similar in structure and oftentimes even have matching, stunningly similar accounts of certain parts of Jesus' life. The Gospel of John, though, is a beast all on its own, taking a much more philosophical look at Jesus than the synoptics do. Still, it covers much of the same material. So Christians will take these Gospels and they'll proudly trumpet them as pristine primary sources and eyewitness evidence of Jesus' divinity. But the reality is much more mundane. The three synoptic Gospels, as already mentioned, were very clearly written off of each other, as they can oftentimes recount the exact same story, almost word for word. In court, witnesses are kept separate for precisely this reason, to keep them from colluding and purposefully trying to sell the exact same story. Beyond the similarity in the synoptics, though, you also run into the simple fact that all of these Gospels were specifically written to encourage belief in Jesus. They were not unbiased historical sources, and so using them that way, as many Christians do, is really quite inappropriate. As a side note, just past the four Gospels is the book of Acts. It's sectioned off as its own book, but it's actually the second half of the book of Luke. It tells the story of the early Christian church after Jesus' death, and also the conversion of a man named Paul, who went from an angry persecutor of Christians to a very famous Christian missionary. I'll get back to him in a second. Just beyond the Gospels are the epistles. These are letters written by a few different authors to various churches in the ancient world. They were written to teach a congregation, reprimand them for some kind of transgression, or just generally report on the author's current state of affairs. Sometimes the authors are self-reported in the text. Other times we are left guessing. The most prominent author of these epistles, though, is Paul, the convert I mentioned earlier. He wrote Romans, Galatians, Philippians, and several more. Finally, at the end of the big book, we have Revelation. Revelation, it's a really misunderstood book. If you recall what I said about the confusing metaphorical style of the prophetic texts, Revelation is written in a very similar style. It references the Old Testament and the prophets almost every couple of verses as a part of its supposed prophecy for the end of days and the apocalypse. Oftentimes, skeptics read Revelation without a solid knowledge of the Old Testament prophecy and end up hopelessly confused, or at least lacking in appreciation for all that Revelation was attempting to convey. Now, as a child, I was encouraged to read parts of this massive collection daily, and when I grew older, I actually did. I was fascinated by the idea that the more I pay attention to the words and the hidden meanings of the book, the more I could learn about this God I worshipped and the universe I believed he created. But as I increasingly encountered difficult passages or books I had trouble agreeing with, a single question continued to present itself. How do we actually know that these books are from God? My question brought up very few solid answers amongst the pastors and congregation I worshipped with, so I instead turned to researching online and reading through theological textbooks my father kept on his library shelves. The more I read, however, the less and less I was convinced. The usual answer given by Christians often begins with authorship. Christians believe that the authors were given wisdom or special knowledge by God because of their position as prophets or apostles, and so their writings must contain God's message. Exodus, for example, claims Moses was commanded by God to write the Pentateuch in its entirety, and so of course it would be authoritative and inspired. The obvious falsehood in that answer lies in one of the problems I mentioned earlier. Authorship for many of the scriptures are almost entirely unknown. Virtually no evidence exists at all for the identity of the authors, and so speaking to their godliness or special position is ridiculous. Beyond that, some of the books, such as the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, is widely accepted by Christians as having unknown authorship, so they don't even bother making an attempt to argue that its author was some kind of apostle or prophet. When this argument fails, Christian doctrine falls back on the reality of the situation. The books of the Bible were selected by the church from a much larger group of texts. The church itself decided which ones they thought were authoritative. The Eastern Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church even have additional books in their Bible that other churches don't recognize. The development of these canons was a slow process over hundreds of years, but it was still completely decided on by early Christians themselves. And so herein we can see one of the most widely accepted forms of circular reasoning in history. Christians believe the Bible is true because they believe it's from God. They believe it's from God because they believed it is true. And with that, I'm going to have to conclude our first episode. I know this was quite a huge topic to grapple. I just really wanted to start off forming a basis of understanding from which to launch all of our later discussions regarding Christian beliefs. If any specific areas or topics interested you, or you have any questions about Christianity you want answered, feel free to email us at fundamentalpodcasts@gmail.com. Our next episode is going to be covering the Christian condemnation of homosexuals, so stay tuned for that. Our intro music, by the way, was made by Joseph McDade, an awesome musician who makes royalty-free music for any and all creators. Check him out at josephmcdade.com. Finally, a quick shout out to my friend Peyton, who made all the art for the podcast. Thank you again.